Today, I'm just going to talk about quickly a recent issue that I wrote a column about for the Real Estate News Exchange, that is renx.ca, here in Canada, about a case from Canada's highest court that has caused quite a stir that I think people should be aware of on the landlord and tenant side. So there was an issue that came up during COVID where commercial tenants, particularly small businesses, but a lot of large businesses too, were running into massive problems, which were obvious. These shutdowns caused by the pandemic rendered them unable to operate. So they weren't having any revenue coming in. They couldn't even go into their, a lot of the time, stores, manufacturing facilities at all. And as a result, they were not bringing any revenue. So they were going to courts and saying, we need some reprieve here. We shouldn't have to pay rent if we can't occupy our premises. And the landlord should be doing more. But over and over, the courts were ruling, sorry, too bad for you. The lease says you have to pay rent. And if you can't do it, then too bad. And that caused a lot of problems, tenants going out of business. Now, one thing tenants were relying on a lot in these situations was something in their leases, it's called a force majeure clause. And essentially, what a clause like that says is we don't have to perform our obligations under this contract if an event outside of our control is making us unable to do it. So, for instance, if a earthquake or tidal wave hits your building, you shouldn't have to pay rent because it's outside of your control. So they were arguing that this pandemic fall fell into that category, so they shouldn't have to do that. But courts were not always siding with them on that. They were saying that doesn't necessarily fall within the ambit of that. But in this recent decision, something interesting happened. In this case, the landlord and tenant had a force majeure clause in the lease that said if the tenant cannot operate for a certain period, if the landlord cannot provide the tenant with usable premises for a certain period due to a force majeure event, then the tenant is permitted to extend its lease afterwards, after the lease expires, for that same period. So in this case, the Ontario Court of Appeal, which is the highest court in this province, agreed. They said, yeah, you know what? The landlord, you couldn't give them usable premises for like around a year because of these government shutdowns during COVID. So the tenant is entitled to extend its lease rent free for a year after it expires to make up for that lost time. So this was causing a stir because the lease did not necessarily say that. And they were arguing that this clause is meant for like temporary things like repairs to the building that take a couple days or months, not something like this that the landlord has no control over. And the landlord was also arguing that we didn't exactly get a break from this either. We weren't, if we didn't don't collect rent money for a certain time, how are we going to pay our mortgage? So landlords are kind of getting their backs up about this because there's a lot of leases that have expired since COVID or will expire. And during that period, landlords have made deals to sell their buildings after lease expires or signs on with a new tenant. So what if other tenants start coming out of the woodwork and saying, well, hang on, we're looking at our force majeure clause. Now we get to extend our lease. So, it depends on the wording of the force majeure clause or what it says, but this is clearly ringing alarm bells on those sides. And I'm getting calls after running that on a daily basis from tenants saying, hey, do I get to extend my lease? So again, it depends on what the clause says and about the situation, but they're worried that this decision is going to open up floodgates. So we're waiting to see what happens. But in the meantime, landlords should, I think, consult their leases carefully, especially if their tenants were affected by government shutdowns as a result of COVID.